Hello. Welcome to Retrieving Reason Podcast, Episode 5. Today we're going to discuss the definition of knowledge. I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and this is a podcast about philosophy, particularly epistemology, or how do we know. Last episode, episode 4, we talked about common ground, and we discussed the necessary methodological starting point for discourse. Today, we want to contrast whether knowledge is possible and there is hope for gaining knowledge, or knowledge is not possible and we're stuck in intellectual despair, which is there's no hope for getting knowledge. This leads to skepticism on one hand and fideism on the other hand, and we'll talk about both of those as we go along. I would like to read a quote from Alvin Plantinga in his book, I have here, Warrant the Current Debate. And this is page 6. It's a rather lengthy quote, so bear with me, but I think it'll help us get into this topic. He says, "It would be colossal understatement to say that Anglo-American epistemology of this century has made much of the notion of epistemic justification. First, of course, there is the widely celebrated justified true belief, or JTB, account or analysis of knowledge, an analysis we imbibed with our mother's milk. According to the inherited lore of the epistemological tribe, the JTB account enjoyed the status of epistemological orthodoxy until 1963, when it was shattered by Edmund Gettier with his 3-page paper, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? After 1963, the justified true belief account of knowledge was seen to be defective and lost its exalted status, but even those convinced by Gettier that justification, along with truth, is not sufficient for knowledge, still mostly think it necessary and nearly sufficient for knowledge." So I'm going to pause there, and this gets us to the Gettier problem. Okay, so here we have a definition of knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. And then we see that Gettier thinks that this definition is not sufficient for knowledge. So we want to use this quote as an entry into the contemporary discussion of the definition of knowledge. And I think we can go with this definition to start with. Justified true belief. Let's break it down and ask, what does it mean, each piece? So to believe something is to affirm a proposition. I believe that the good is knowledge. Okay, I'm affirming that. It's a proposition, the good is knowledge, and I affirm that. Okay, now, for that proposition to be true, then reality should match the sentence, right? So this is the correspondence theory of truth. What is true is what accords with reality or corresponds with reality. So the sentence, the good is knowledge, is true if and only if reality is such that the good is actually knowledge. Now, I don't really want to defend the correspondence theory of truth right now. I have done that elsewhere. But I can do that, but I think today is not the day to do it. I'm going to go with the correspondence theory of truth for now, and usually that is the theory that is assumed in this JTB analysis. Justification is the piece that guarantees we have true belief, and justification is the piece that is up for discussion in the contemporary debate. So, how do you guarantee that you have a true belief? Now, Edmund Gettier gives us a lot of examples that he thinks, here's an example where we have justified true belief and we don't have knowledge. So I'll give you an example that comes from Roderick Chisholm, and this is the one I learned when I was a student and it stuck with me. It's kind of my favorite, and it goes a little bit like this. Let's say you're out walking in a field and you see what you take to be a sheep on the hill, and perhaps you have other evidence that there are sheep in the area. Maybe it smells like sheep. You hear the bleating of sheep, but you think you see a sheep on the hill, and you form the belief there's a sheep on the hill. Well, what you're actually seeing is a sheep-shaped rock. But behind the sheep-shaped rock is a real sheep. But you don't see the real sheep. You see the sheep-shaped rock. So you form the belief there's a sheep on the hill. It's true there's a sheep on the hill. You're justified because you have evidence of sheep in the area. But you don't have knowledge. Okay, this is how the Gettier examples go. You can go online and Google Gettier examples and Gettier problems, and you'll see hundreds of these. There are many, many, many examples. Now, I did an analysis of this in my book, Retrieving Knowledge. Where did I put that book? Somewhere in my library. Retrieving Knowledge, in which I showed all of the Gettier examples have these things in common. Either they rely on our senses. It's a kind of assumption of empiricism. Evidence is through the senses. Or testimony, which is what someone else said, and usually it's because they had evidence through the senses. So justification seems to be assumed to be evidence through the senses or testimony of others. Now, the problem is these things can be doubted, and the Gettier problems are meant to show us that there are problems with our senses, perhaps, problems with the environment. So he's going to say that justification isn't sufficient. He proposes there's some fourth condition, and then he doesn't tell us what it is. So now philosophers scramble to find the fourth condition. So let's put that on hold for a moment, because what Alvin Plantinga sets out to do in his project, and these there are 3 in this series. This one that I showed you a moment ago, Warrant the Current Debate, is the first, and the other 2 are Warrant and Proper Function and Warranted Christian Belief. So he puts forward his own theory of knowledge in those 2 books. So let's talk about Alvin Plantinga's proposed, what do you want to call it, redefinition of knowledge. So he says justification is not necessary for knowledge. What he proposes instead is warrant. And he says a belief is warranted if it is formed by cognitive faculties that are functioning properly in an appropriate environment and according to a good design plan. So you have these 4 things, okay? Cognitive function in an appropriate environment according to a good design plan. I forgot one other piece there. Anyways, they all have to be together in order to have knowledge. Your cognitive faculties have to be functioning properly. That was the first one. So, for example, brains are working properly in an appropriate environment for brains, and it's because there was a good design plan for brains that fit that environment. So I kind of think this doesn't work either, because Plantinga assumes Gettier's empiricism, that our knowledge is through the senses, and he also sort of smuggles in some assumptions with his definition of warrant that I don't think we have to do. For example, he says that if your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, you will form the following kinds of beliefs: that there are other minds, that the material world exists, that you could pretty much trust your memory beliefs, and that God exists. All right, so if your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, you believe that there is a God. Well, what about people who don't believe in God? Well, I think he would say that there's some cognitive malfunction there, and he calls it sin. All right, so that's the 3rd book in the series, Warranted Christian Belief. I don't really want to touch that one right now. I argue in my little book, Reason and Proper Function. Can you see that? Reason and Proper Function, a response to Alvin Plantinga, that reason can't malfunction. Reason, the laws of thought cannot malfunction. So I do an analysis of what it means to have cognitive malfunction, and I argue instead that perhaps there's something like cognitive non-function. All those things we talked about in proto-epistemology, I give as an alternative to cognitive malfunction. But going back to his definition of warrant, he thinks that there is a good design plan, and that's because of course there's a designer. So he kind of gives us a circular argument as well. So you will form beliefs in God if your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, and they are because God designed them that way. And if you don't believe in God, there's some kind of cognitive malfunction, which makes me wonder, can you be responsible for that? I mean, can you really help it if you have cognitive malfunction, and can God hold you accountable for that? God, I didn't know you existed because my cognitive faculties aren't functioning properly. I don't know, there seems to be something fishy in there. And I think it leads to a kind of fideism, faith, belief without proof or understanding. So I don't think that's a good way to go. And I don't think Gettier's skepticism is a good way to go. So Gettier kind of leaves us with this idea that, well, we can't have justification, so perhaps we can't know. So both Plantinga and Gettier assume that knowledge is through the senses, or justification is through the senses, and our senses can deceive us, or our cognitive faculties can malfunction, or the environment could be bad, and perhaps we can't form knowledge because of environmental causes. For example, the sheep on the hill, maybe the person who formed the belief that there's a sheep on the hill wasn't wearing their glasses that day. Maybe that's a kind of cognitive malfunction. Or maybe it was foggy out and the environment wasn't right for forming true beliefs that day. I don't know. I don't think that this is the kind of justification that Plato had in mind. So if you hearken back to that quote I read from Plantinga's book, he said that this definition goes back to Plato. I did my graduate studies on Plato's definition of knowledge, and that's not what I found. So I'm going to give you an alternative to the JTB analysis of knowledge, and I call it the TOA definition of knowledge. And the TOA definition of knowledge I get from Plato's Theaetetus. I also talk about this in my book, Retrieving Knowledge. Okay, so here's the definition. Knowledge is a true opinion with an account. True opinion with an account, TOA. Now, a true opinion is like a true belief, but the word for opinion in the Greek is doxa. And doxa is like it seems, or it seems to me, or it appears. So doxa is appearance, and Plato says we don't want mere appearance, we want reality. So we don't want to go with what just appears to be true. We want what is actually true. And so an appearance and a true appearance are different. So something can appear, like it appears that there's a sheep on the hill, but it's not true because what I see is a rock that's shaped like a sheep. But let's say I go up there and I find the sheep that's behind the rock. Then I have a true opinion, or a true seeming. But you know what? Someone could come along and say, well, how do you know we're not, in the Matrix and these aren't real sheep, they're virtual sheep. Oh no, I don't know anymore. So Plato thinks a true opinion, it's good enough for action, but it's not good enough for knowledge. You need to tie that true opinion down with a logos. And a logos is like an argument or like reasons, so that you don't lose your true opinion when questioned. You don't lose it because you got flustered. So true opinion for Plato is good enough for action, because if you have a true opinion and you have knowledge, you're going to do the same thing. But true opinion isn't the same as knowledge, and it could fly out of your head. So you need to tie it down with an account. Now, it may be the case that we still need to address the fourth condition. Maybe we want to add a fourth condition. I'd like to add a fourth condition. I propose a fourth condition in my book, in my little book. I'm plugging books today. Reason and proper function. I propose what I call the Carefulness Criterion. Because I think that there's not cognitive malfunction, but there's cognitive non-function or lack of function, the Carefulness Criterion is something like epistemological virtue. And I can just tell you some of the virtues include being a critical thinker. Maybe you have taken a logic class and you know how to think critically. Maybe you know what informal fallacies look like and you don't use them and you don't let others get away with using them on you. Maybe patience is part of the carefulness criterion because we need time sometimes to go through discussions and dialogue, and we need to come back and discuss it again and again. Perseverance, we have to stick with a discussion, stick with an argument, be gradual in our approach, hoping for progress, but not expecting too much and giving up. And perhaps another intellectual virtue or epistemological virtue is a community of people who also are pursuing knowledge, pursuing the truth. So I think that we need to cultivate the intellectual virtues or epistemological virtues as part of the fourth condition, or the carefulness criterion is what I call it. And I think there's another thing we need to keep in mind. Knowledge is justified true belief with a caveat. Okay, so we can say, yeah, that definition seems right, but to both satisfy what Gettier is looking for, which is ordinary examples of knowledge in our daily lives, and what Plato is looking for, which is philosophical knowledge. Not just like, oh yeah, I know my spouse is sitting in front of me, but yeah, I know what ultimate reality is like. Those are two different things. So the first kind of knowledge, I know, what my spouse is doing right now. We can say there's ordinary knowledge or even scientific knowledge where we use that word kind of loosely. We can say there's two kinds of justification. So justified true belief, version 1, is where we have weak justification. And weak justification is sensory data, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, that leads to a high probability of truth. And that's what we need most of the time, right? Like if I see a sheep on the hill, I don't need to know 100% that there's a sheep on the hill unless it's a life or death issue, which I couldn't imagine happening, right? But for other things, particularly philosophical claims, that kind of evidence, sensory data, is not going to be helpful to us. We need something stronger. So we'll go for strong justification. And strong justification is by reason and argument, such that the opposite position is impossible. And this is a method that Socrates often uses. In the Theaetetus itself, they start off, knowledge is through the senses, and knowledge is perception. That's what it. Knowledge is perception. And Socrates says, well, let's play that out. What does that mean? And then he shows how that's impossible. Knowledge is not perception. So he rules that out because it's impossible. So when we rule out alternatives, logical options, what we're left with is the piece that we know. All right. So strong justification is by reason and argument, not by the senses, such that the opposite position is impossible. This is like providing a reductio ad absurdum. It's about knowing some logic and knowing the square of opposition and what a contradiction is and how they both can't be true and both can't be false in the same respect and at the same time because of the law of excluded middle. So we can say that the definition of knowledge is justified true belief, and that there's weak justification, which is for ordinary everyday things, and there's strong justification, which is necessary for philosophical claims, like what is eternal and what is the good life. Is it possible to have strong justification? I would say yes, it is. And if you don't believe me, go and look to see what Socrates is doing. I know a lot of people think, oh, Socrates claimed to not have knowledge. Well, at the beginning of his life, he said, the one thing I know is that I don't know. But he didn't stay there. He spent the rest of his life pursuing knowledge. And if you read between the lines and you watch what he's doing, you see that he does have to arrive at some conclusions. Even in that Theaetetus dialogue, some people think, oh, look, they never get to a definition at the end. Yeah, they do, because they've ruled out all the others. So he does get to knowledge's true belief, true opinion with an account. But if you don't believe me, go read it. Okay, now, is knowledge possible? Yes. And I think it's because we're going to use a different method than Gettier and Plantinga. If we go by reason and argument, we can arrive at knowledge. And we're not going to get stuck in the skepticism of Gettier, where he thought justification was through the senses, and the senses don't deliver anything that guarantees true belief. And we're not going to go with Plantinga and his redefinition of knowledge as warrant, which assumes empiricism again, and then also runs into a circular argument because you need a good designer in order to get a good design plan. And then he's got all this baggage with proper function and sin. I don't think we need to go that way. Incidentally, Plantinga has this way he lets in strong justification through the back door. He thinks that, let's say I'm warranted in believing God because I just find myself believing God, especially when I'm in the face of beauty, and I meet someone who doesn't believe in God. So let's say I believe in God, person B does not believe in God, person B now serves as a defeater to my warrant. So now I have to come up with a defeater in order to keep my warrant. Well, this person could come up with a defeater. And then I have to come up with a defeater. You see how this goes? This is arguments. So even though Plantinga seems to reject the traditional view of justification, and I don't even want to say it's traditional, the Gettier empiricist version of justification, he ends up with Plato's providing an account in the end. So I think if we can say knowledge is justified true belief with strong justification by reason and argument, then we can have hope. Then knowledge is possible. And this leads us to go, okay, what is reason and argument now? So that's something we have to explore in future episodes. What is reason and argument, and how do they enable us to get knowledge? All right, so let's wrap things up for this episode. What did we talk about today? We talked about Gettier introducing the JTB, or Justified True Belief Analysis of Knowledge. We saw some of his examples to challenge the sufficiency of this definition. We saw how Plantinga tried to address Gettier's challenges by saying that justification isn't necessary for knowledge, and he provided a different definition based on warrant. But we saw that they both assume empiricism, all of our knowledge is through the senses, and we proposed, okay, justified true belief plus strong justification, which is not by the senses, it's by reason and argument, is how we can get knowledge. And so there is hope that we can know, and we don't have to get stuck in skepticism, which says we can't know, or fideism, which says we can't know, we just have to believe anyway, which both lead to intellectual despair. All right, my friends, knowledge is possible. And that's why we do these podcasts, because I want you to have hope. Okay, so thank you for joining me for this episode, and please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks, have a great day.